City. Well, I don't care. Huh? Oh. Actually, we don't need this, so I'm gonna set that aside. Becky, so are they promoting that folks can send questions to you if they have them, or what are we doing? Okay, okay.
Have not been in this space, since the pandemic, because where we hold Saturday morning services. So it's beginning in a week from Saturday morning back here.
Oh, so there have not been any
There has
services back
not
here,
been
everything's just been
during
live
the
stream?
pandemic, so it's through the efforts, primarily the efforts of one of the congregants, did all the legwork to get those services on Zoom, which is, it's been very helpful, but boy, it's not like
It's not the
in
same, is it?
person.
Are you looking forward to it being back in person?
Absolutely,
You'd
absolutely.
be here with bells on.
Well, there's, one of the things that is what brought me here, we discarded early on the Zoom calls, and that is actually chanting from the Torah and chanting Haftorah. And um, so that's, and then there's just the camaraderie.
So are we waiting for Phyllis to join us, or what are we doing? Is that what we're doing? Thank you. How long have you been part of the congregation here?
Uh, Not an exceptionally long time. I actually have a dual membership.
Okay.
I've been a member of the congregation in Newport Beach for probably somewhere close to 50 years. And, but it was the fact that they, this, uh, they decided not to continue with their Saturday morning service.
Oh, even, not. Of course. How does that work? Can I be heard on Zoom, on live stream? Hello, testing. Hello, hello, everyone. Is the live stream working? The live stream is working. So, folks on the live stream, if you would stand by for just a couple of more minutes, we will get started.
So, so we discontinued it, and that's what I did almost every week there. So, you know, I live now down in Maiden Point. We used to live closer to Newport. So, they had this. I'm not, this part is the conservative portion upstairs
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to those of you who are here, and welcome to those of you who are joining us through live stream. We are delighted that you're here this evening as we spend the next hour or so thinking together about dealing with fear, dealing with all of the different kinds of emotions and things that we are facing in this very unprecedented time. So if you have joined us by stream, you will have an opportunity in a little while or at any time during the evening to text a question to the phone of Becky LaMaca, and I will tell you that phone number in just a moment, and then I will say it again a couple of times during the broadcast so that if you would like to engage with us, offer a comment or a question or that sort of thing a little closer to 8 o'clock this evening, I'll ask Becky to share those with us. And so the telephone number that you want to perhaps write down to have on hand is area code 949-677-7485. So that's 949-677-7485. And then I'll say it again a little bit later if there's something that you'd like to, an issue you'd like to raise, a comment you'd like to offer, a question you'd like addressed, or certainly if you're having any trouble with the live stream audio or video, you can also text a message to Becky, and she'll do her best to help you resolve that. So we're excited that you're here tonight. What I'd like to do in our time together is to talk about some considerations for facing fears. And there, during this period of time, there are several people here in the temple at Temple Bethel, and then we're broadcasting this from the chapel. And then I know there are quite a number of folks that are also watching this by live stream. And again, the phone number, if you're on live stream, is area code 949-677-7485. So we are living in a time that is filled with fear in lots of different ways. And when we started planning this program several months ago, we thought that we would be at a point now that we would be perhaps certainly not talking about post-pandemic, but talking more about the fact that the worst seemed to be behind us, and we are moving on into a fairly certain future. And of course, I think it is likely true from a scientific standpoint that the worst is behind us, but that doesn't mean by any means, unlike the advice given by the TSA agent in the airport where I was yesterday morning, who said, folks, ignore those dots on the floor, the pandemic is over. Clearly that's not true. So what we'll do tonight is to talk about what do we do with the fear that tends to be sort of free-floating. And for those of you who are in the room, I know you have an outline in front of you, and I'll repeat kind of major issues several times because I recognize that folks that are tuned in from the live stream don't have access to a printed handout in front of them. The first of those considerations, though, that I'd like us to talk a bit about is to acknowledge fear's reality. Now, one of the things that I've discovered over now a little more than 35 years of taking care of the dying and bereaved and addressing folks on a wide variety of mental health issues is that fear is deeply maligned in our culture. There are folks who seem to think that fear is a sign of weakness, or it's a sign that one is lacking faith, or any number of other possibilities. And what I'd like to submit is that in fact fear is a very real emotion, and it's not really even just an emotion. It is an all-encompassing experience, which really does change how we see the world in some very profound ways. One thing to kind of think about is that fear is really a present danger that is realistically possible at this moment, but that's different than anxiety, which is really an anticipated expectation of something bad happening, even if there's not any particular evidence that to support that fact or to support that notion. And what I'd like to suggest this evening is that in many ways dealing with fear in an experience like what we are walking through now is a perfectly normal response. The more unexpected, the more unlikely the event or the series of events are, the more likely it is that we become fearful, that we become people who are gathered up, if you will, by this sense of fear. What we have noticed, however, over the years in the mental health community is that when fear is not dealt with in a healthy way as it comes, when we don't acknowledge it, when we don't do some of these other things we're going to talk about tonight, what happens frequently is that fear leads to what appears to be a full-blown anxiety disorder, which might even need to be treated professionally or with medication or that sort of thing. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge fear, that we say, yeah, this is real. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest is that whether we're talking about guilt or anger or fear or any of the other major kinds of emotions that we humans experience, there really is not, there's really no reason to depreciate it or to pretend like it's not real. In fact, every emotion has an extraordinarily rational basis underneath it or that undergirds it. The only difference is that it's rational to me as the person experiencing it, even though it may not be rational to people around me. And that's one of the reasons I think that emotions are often discredited by others who like to consider ourselves more rational or whatever the reason may be. And so I think one of the most important gifts we give to ourselves and to the people around us is to say, no, there's really a good reason for me to be fearful. I have a sense right now that something is uncontrollable in my environment. And so I want to do everything I can to try to bring that back in. So in other words, acknowledging fear is an extraordinarily important first step or first consideration. A second one, and I think this is maybe both more practical and also harder for us to get our hands around, and that's to appreciate fear's benefits. Quite a number of years ago, I read this notion that fear really is an acronym that stands for false evidence appearing real. Unfortunately, it's not a very good way to think about fear because it implies that fear has no basic evidence underneath it. And the truth is that's simply not true. So right now, people are fearful about a number of things. I'm going to invite the folks in the room to join me by listing some of the things that people are frightened of right now. So just call them out if you would, and then I'll say them again in the microphone so the folks who are live streaming can hear. Yes, sir.
My fear was that at my age, because of all the restrictions, I feel that I've lost about a year and a half of my life.
Yeah. So one of the fears that I have is the fear of missing out on important experiences, whether with family or with friends. And the older we get, the more we realize 18 months, a year and a half, or now longer that's a big chunk of what I expect I have left. When I'm 20, a year and a half isn't that long. I've got lots of time to make it up. When I'm 60 or 70 or 80, and I'm not by any means suggesting you are, but when I get to be more advanced in years, I realize, wow, 18 months could be kind of the long shot, that could be the long game of what I've got left. So, absolutely. Am I saying it pretty much like you're thinking it? Yeah. Yeah, okay. All right, somebody else. What do we fear right now? Yeah, Steve. Yeah. So fear for, and when you say fear for them, you mean fear for their health, fear for their safety, and those kinds of things. And they're not here, so I can't really get eyes on them, right? So yeah, okay, yeah, all right. Somebody else. What do we fear, sir?
So, we very quickly came to market this vaccine.
Okay.
What was left out of that was possible long-term effects. So on one hand, it was important to get, at least for me speaking, to get the vaccine. But the thought that, hey, what may happen a year and a half, 2 years down the road.
Right. Yeah. So for many people, there's a sense of fear about, and I'm going to expand that just a little. I don't know how, I maybe don't understand how the vaccine was developed. I don't know. I know that there wasn't a long enough track record for it to have been followed over a long period of time. There certainly are some people who are old enough to remember, for example, the development of the polio vaccine, but might have forgotten that it did not have a very long track record on knowing what its value or what the potential side effects and that sort of thing might be either. And we're accustomed in our society, of course, to bringing out a vaccine that we then test and retest and modify over the years. And those of us, of course, who are taking the first generation, in some ways, it likely feels fearfully like I'm a guinea pig. I'm part of the test dummy, and certainly the later renditions will, in all probability, be different or better or whatever. But the truth is, I'm fearful because I don't know. And I think there's nothing irrational about that fear. That none of these fears we've talked about or any of the 100 others. It's not irrational for me to be concerned about family whom I cannot see. It is not irrational for me to think about maybe at my age I'll live 5 years or 10 years or 2 years, to think about that I might not have forever and losing a year and a half, and the problem is losing a time frame that I don't know how much longer it will go becomes very problematic. Yes, Becky.
We do have a comment from
Okay.
our virtual audience. The fear is that it is all going to come back. We are going
Yeah.
into this second phase of the surge that we saw at the end of last year, beginning of this year.
All right, so the fear that it's coming back, that it's all going to come back, that history's going to repeat itself. We're going to have last spring all over again, or last fall, or this past winter all over again, and it's going to be the same thing, and it's going to maybe even come back with a greater vengeance because all of that. And again, that is not an irrational fear. The part of the difficulty with dealing with fear is that we often don't know all. If we knew all the parameters, it would probably reduce our fearfulness, and because we don't, fear tends to arise. So, is there any benefit to fear? I would submit there is. I would submit that fear has benefit to us psychologically and spiritually. I've thought of two things, and I would welcome either the folks on the audience if they want to text, or the folks here in the room to offer any additional. But I'll just tell you the two that I've thought of where fear is actually beneficial. In the first place, I think fear keeps me safe. There is no question in my mind that a fear of being in a bad car crash or getting a $250 ticket causes me to drive more slowly than I might be if left to my own devices, especially on the wide open road in Texas where I live, where one could conceivably drive 85 or 90 and not hit anything except a tumbleweed blowing across the road or something like that. So the reality is that it can be that fear keeps me safe, and that a fear of, again, being caught or having a consequence that is harmful may be beneficial in keeping me safe. I would submit that throughout the pandemic, some healthy fear has maybe caused people to take precautions that, left to their own devices, would not have otherwise taken. It might be a fear of reprisals. It might be a fear of getting into a fight at the supermarket with somebody else because I choose not to wear a mask. It might be any number of things. And therefore, by my staying somewhat fearful, it may have actually worked in my favor. The second thing, and I believe this is a more important issue, or at least it is for me, and I'll entertain your thoughts about it, and that is that fear also reminds me that I am not in charge. That there are forces. I happen to think that there is a divine force, a God that is in charge. But even if that doesn't appear to be so, there is a whole lot in this world that I am not able to control. And fear is a really good reminder to me of that. The fact that I am frightened of things that are outside of my ability to manage reminds me that the world is bigger and more nuanced than what I am able to manage on my own. And for me, that is an extraordinarily important benefit, to be reminded that I am not in charge. Years ago, I heard the famous motivational speaker, Zig Ziglar, and he said, there are three things I know, and I know that I know. And here they are. There is a God, I'm not God, and you aren't either. And I think that's a pretty good way for me to sort of capture this notion that I am not in charge of the world. And fear is one of the ways, it's one of many tools in the universe that keep me well grounded in the fact that life is not under my control. Yes, sir. Tell me your first name. I'm sorry.
That's Barry.
Barry. Thank you, Barry.
You bet. But also on the other side of the coin, though, with recognizing that there are forces out there that could represent a negative, or perhaps have a negative impact on me. Or
Okay.
people that I know or love, so there is two sides. To me, there's two sides to
A-
that coin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I don't in any way want to be Pollyanna about this and say, oh, fear is a good thing and we should just embrace it with impunity, as much as I'm suggesting that mostly in our culture we talk about its negative connotations without ever saying, oh, but there are some things about fear that actually might work to my benefit. So great thought there, Barry. Here's a third idea that I'd like to offer up, and that is that one of the ways to manage fear is to begin making a catalog of them, to actually list what they are. I'm going to quit talking for a couple of minutes. If you're writing this down at home or here, I'd invite you just to make a list. Begin making a list of what are some of the things we fear. You've already listed a few of them in our conversation at the beginning, but there might be others. I'm not going to ask you to share. I'm just going to ask you to make the list, and I'm going to be quiet for a couple of minutes while you do that. And then I'll tell you why I think it's important that we do that. So begin making your catalog, and you can work on this as much as you want over the next week or however long. why did I ask you to begin making a list? What benefits do you see to making a list of fears? Phyllis?
To be more mindful and in the moment to understand what you're feeling so you don't really get out of control.
All right. I become more mindful to what I'm experiencing so that it doesn't get out of control. Thank you. Somebody else? Makes you face them. How so, Michael?
Have a tendency to want to deny that they're there and just it doesn't exist, and it attempts to get me on the blind side as a result of that. So
Yeah.
if I'm facing them, acknowledging them, like you said, maybe that's just a
Yeah.
way of putting it. Acknowledging that it's real, I'm going to face it head on, and with the
Yeah.
help that I have, whether it be divine or otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, so it forces me, or at least it sets up the possibility for success anyway, that I would actually face the fear and come to terms with it because I'm labeling it. One of the things I've noticed over my life is that most of the things that become debilitatingly fearful, all right? So they actually will stop me in my tracks, or things that are just this free-floating anxiety that I have no name for. And when I begin to name it and label it and give words to it, it does a couple of things. One, it makes it much easier to manage, but I think the main reason it makes it easier to manage is because it's now not this big just force out there, but it actually becomes the elephant I eat a bite at a time because I've labeled the bites with actual words instead of just this amorphous kind of substance. So I think there's great benefit to labeling our fears or labeling any kind of experience that is distressing to us. Just to put words to it becomes very powerful. And you may have noticed, those of you who have reared children when they were little and feared things under the bed, you could try to talk about there not being anything under the bed as much as you wanted. But when you came into the room with them and got down on the floor with them and shined the flashlight under the bed, it became much more easy for them to go back to sleep. And one of the reasons is because you labeled it. You showed them what is, or in this case is not, and maybe their mom wasn't too excited about you being under the bed because she had forgotten to dust under there or whatever, but you get my point anyway, right? So the truth is that labeling or cataloging our fears becomes an important part of sucking the power out of the fear. Fear labeled becomes far less powerful over our lives if we will just give words to it. It tends to become much less powerful. Here's the fourth idea, is to look for contrary evidence. Now maybe that's really where the monsters under the bed fit better, I'm not sure. But it's the idea that whatever the fear is that I've labeled, there is some rational basis for why I think that. So let me ask myself, is there any contrary evidence that actually refutes my fear? Is there anything that actually speaks against the fear? So let me give you a very clear, specific example. So yesterday, my daughter told me that she had read something on Facebook that indicated large numbers of people in her age group, their 20s and 30s, who were having very serious illness with the Delta variant of COVID. She's right, okay? That's true. What she did not know, however, was that all of the data that we have presently shows that a number of between 90 and, depending on which study you're reading this week, but somewhere between 89.5% and about 96.5% of the people who are ill enough to be hospitalized with the Delta variant are not vaccinated. Now, I searched this morning for news reports that report any of that data. And I did find one, though it took me a little bit of time to find it, actually. But what I found mostly that reported that data was not mainstream news media. It was mostly the state of Washington's health department or the CDC or the NIH or ABC. ABC actually commissioned a study in which they interviewed, as I recall, 5 intensive care doctors and actually got data from intensive care units at 5 hospitals across the United States. And there's some things like that, but there just was not much news media reported to it. Instead, what I found when I started looking for that data was that most of the headlines implied that there was just this uptick and lots of people in their 20s and 30s were going to the hospital, but did not get the nuance of how the vaccine had made a difference. Now, I'm not saying that to promote that you should go get a vaccine or you're not. I'm out of my scope of practice when I start making those recommendations. What I do want to say, however, is that you have to be very careful about the evidence you use. If most of your news media comes from Facebook, chances are pretty good the evidence is not going to be sound. And I've discovered that I don't want evidence that's been mediated by the mainstream media, and I don't care if you read CNN, Fox, or neither of the above, you're probably not getting a full picture. So I get my news media, for example, about COVID by going to the NIH and the CDC websites. And I figure that's about as good as we've got right now, and that's certainly going to be data that's better than what I can get that has been mediated through the Waco Trib or whatever your favorite news media might be. I do the same thing, by the way, with Baylor University sports. You probably know that I teach at Baylor, and 2 of our big teams have just announced that they're leaving the Big 12, which is bad news in Central Texas where I live. And but I don't spend a lot of time listening to the commentary on ESPN about that. If I want to know what Baylor is thinking, I go look at our university sports website, because at least then I'm getting it from the horse's mouth instead of as it's been edited and re-edited and reformed. So what I'm really doing here is I am suggesting the very same thing I teach my medical students about being good consumers of research, good consumers of data, and that includes always thinking about what's the source that's behind this. So the 2 questions that I ask myself is, or the one question is, what evidence potentially refutes this fear? What is it that, now that does not mean that if I don't like the fear, I'm going to go look for evidence to prove that it's irrational or it's not helpful. But what I am suggesting simply is that what I want to make sure is that rather than being paralyzed by the fear, let me get some facts, and I'm going to check a number of different sources to try to get the very best facts that I can. Part of the dilemma that I think we've dealt with, and we've sort of dealt with this all along related to the COVID pandemic, is that the facts are always changing. And in case you're not aware of how the scientific process works, that's very much it. The other alternative would be to sit on information until we had all the answers. And in the case of COVID, that would have been very detrimental to the population. We'd had a lot more people die if we'd have just kind of waited until we knew all of the outcomes. But the nature of science is sometimes ideas change over time. As we become more aware of new evidence, we may backpedal, or we may change a perspective, or we may say something that we used to say was okay is not okay. Maybe I'm the only one in the room old enough to have ever had a physician who walked out of the examining room and smoked in the hallway. But I did. My family doctor did that, and he did it all the time, and you'd about choke to death coming in and out of the doctor's office. Well, no physician does that anymore, because since then the Surgeon General has warned us, and we've got all kinds of evidence that says that that's really bad. and that it's helpful, that it's harmful, that and the same is true on and on and on we could go. There is a survivor bias. You know, I grew up never riding in a car seat, so it would be easy for me to say, well, clearly car seats don't help any. I'm here, aren't I? Well, that's because I'm not one of the thousands of kids who died in car crashes back in the 1960s when nobody rode in a car seat. That's the nature of science. As we learn more things, we very often say, well, what we thought was okay really isn't okay after all. Another really good example of that, and several of us in the room are just about of probably the age to have reared children during this era. When our daughter was born in 1993, the conventional wisdom was you put babies to bed on their stomach. By the time our son was born in 1995, we said, egads, don't do that. That increases the risk of SIDS. Put your kids to bed on their backs. I think it has changed at least once more in the 25 years since then. And we have now, I think, fairly solidly come to the conclusion that the best way for an infant to be put to bed is on his or her back, I think, unless that has changed. Well, that doesn't mean that we had bad science before and now we all of a sudden have good science, or we had bad science, good science, bad science, good science. It is more likely that as we learn more, we adapt. And one of the things that I think is particularly important is that we recognize that that's the nature of the scientific enterprise, to always be testing and altering hypotheses accordingly and saying, you know what, we got it wrong the first time, or we got it partially wrong the first time. And if we depend only on a mediated approach to science, there's a really good chance that we will not hear the facts as they are coming out of a scientist's mouth. All right. Here's the, fifth kind of idea. And that's to do what I call affirm the yes and strategy. So very frequently, I think what we want to do is we want to say things are black and white, either or. It's either this or it's that. Just this afternoon, I was talking with a colleague of mine who leads a nonprofit organization. And she and I were talking. I used to be a board member, and I'm still an advisor to that organization. We were talking about kind of how they manage finances and how they process donations and some things like that. And what she said in our conversation was, we can do this or we can do that. And honestly, as I heard her explain all of the ramifications of those two options, what I thought was, I think both of those ideas stink. Now, I didn't tell her that, by the way. But what I found myself doing as we had this hour-long conversation this afternoon was I finally said, you know, Lisa, I'm wondering if there might not be a third option out there somewhere. And I don't know what it is right now. I'm not coming up with it. Frankly, I'm far too tired this afternoon to be thinking creatively about the financial management of this organization. But if neither of these options feels very good, that might be a pretty good indication I ought to at least consider the fact there could be a third one out there somewhere. And the truth is, if we start looking for another option, we might find 3 or 4 or 5. There may be all kinds of things that present themselves. And that's what I mean by a yes and strategy. And when we really say, yeah, that may be true, and this may also be true. And they seem to be at loggerheads. They seem to be contradictory, but possibly they are not. What we're really thinking about here is, instead of everything having to be either this or that, is there some nuance that includes some of this and some of that, and maybe some of a third or a fourth or a fifth perspective that we haven't even thought about yet. Now, what I think that does for me is it helps to increase my own respect. Everybody knows that COVID has been highly politicized in the U.S. and in many other places over the last 18 months. And I think one of the things that creates polarization and politicization, I guess if that's the right word, but certainly polarization in any kind of great social debate is when we do not have any modicum of respect for those who don't think like I do. And honestly, this is a knife that cuts both ways. I hear people on the right who are intolerant of ideas from the left, and I hear people on the left who are every bit as intolerant of ideas that are coming from the right. And often what happens is we miss all of those nuanced ideas that lie in between because I am so convinced I'm right and you're wrong. And therefore, I think one of the things that happens in helping us manage fear is when we begin to think about yes and. Yes, my perspective has some factual evidence behind it, and so does yours. Now, I might like my evidence better than yours. I might like me better than you. But that's okay. At least we can be respectful as we learn from each other and as we dialogue. And the interesting thing is sometimes that in itself helps to reduce our fear. All right, so I have 3 more ideas to share, but before I get to them, let me just remind those of you who are on the, what do we call this thing, the live stream, that the phone number to which you can text an idea, a question, a comment, or a rebuttal, if you'd like, is 949-677-7485. 949-677-7485, and I'll get to those in just a second. For those of you in the room, I'm wondering if something that has sort of percolated to the top so far is an idea that you'd like to clarify or you'd like to offer a rebuttal to or offer any thought that might have come up. Barry, go for it.
The idea that we were talking about that your a colleague had 2 ideas and you said, well, there may be a third. Is there a possibility that that has been a personality, you might overthink that project and
Oh.
maybe try to come out with too many answers that might make it more difficult to come to some sort of reasonable conclusion?
Great question. What I'll say is, if that is possible, it has never happened that I can remember in my thinking. I far, and you may be right, it may be personality. I tend to jump at the first conclusion without pondering what other possibilities are. Now, clearly there are some things that don't make any difference. What color of slacks I'm wearing today, I will not stand in the closet and constern over that for the next 45 minutes trying to decide, because the decision doesn't make any difference. And there certainly are pieces of life, and I'm being a little bit flippant about that, but there's some decisions just don't make any difference. Am I going to have the salmon or the steak? It might make a difference to my waistline, but it won't make a great difference in the cosmic scheme of things. So I think I could spend so much time being paralyzed by the decision-making process that I might not ever make a decision, or if I do, I've already missed the opportunity passing by. In my personality style, I am far less inclined to think of all the possibilities or even more than one, and I jump to the first one I see, and that's what frequently comes back to bite me in the butt. So I may be speaking out of my own experience there, and I'd love to hear any other thoughts. I know, Steve, you've certainly led business kinds of projects. I don't know if you have any thought about that from management sort of things, but how's that for putting you on the spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think you learn from experience in any walk of life that what you may have thought as you look out the window and you see what you see, that as you got closer to the window, you see a completely different thing. So I think we've learned, or I like to think that, and so to your point, you kind of hesitate a bit, you kind of think it through a little bit. Very often, it's the simplest answer is the right answer. It's common sense think in my experience, when I was in my twenties, and people that I know now that are in their twenties, I try to impress upon them that what you see is maybe not the full picture.
Ah.
And try to help them think about the visual thought of, this window analogy that I use quite a bit
Yeah.
myself, to help me make a decision, and not judge, and I'm not in their shoes. I couldn't really, so I have to kind of learn that.
So let me summarize a couple of things I heard here. One of them is that our perspective changes what we see about the possibilities out there. And Steve's metaphor is if I move up close to the window, my view of the outside is very different than when I'm standing back across the room trying to look out the window. When I get close, I get a much wider view, I guess is that where, am I hearing that correctly? Yeah. And then also there is the notion that's important, and that's to remember that sometimes, well, as a graduate school professor of mine once said, if the common sense makes good sense, don't look for any other sense. And that's not a bad word of advice many times either, that sometimes, as Barry said, we overthink things. And while I don't tend to overthink things, there's certainly the potential for that. And folks who maybe already are given to an anxiety disorder may very well tend to overthink issues, and should I do this or should I do that? So that's probably a important piece, and to watch for the common sense, the common idea. And then also a piece that I heard you say is that simply the wisdom of the years makes a lot of difference. And those of us who have gray hair in the room, well, those of us who have any hair in the room, if it's gray, appreciate that word of advice. I believe it is the Hebrew scriptures that say that probably in one of the wisdom books that the gray head is the crown of life. Does it sound familiar, sort of? And I think there's a lot of wisdom in gray, personally. And the more gray I get, the more wisdom I think there is in it. And my young colleagues and young students really ought to pay attention to those of us who now have, lead in our butts and silver in our hair, or whatever the case may be, right? I mean, it's time. The metallic age has some real benefit. And part of that is simply the awareness that when you've lived longer, you tend, the things that used to bother you a lot, just the years have blunted some of those concerns. And that's true for me. I mean, the things that were life and death issues, not that I don't have convictions, but many of the things that were life and death, go to the mat kind of things when I was 25, at 60 simply are not that, hey, it's not that important. And sometimes when you get to be 85, it's not important at all. And so I think that's also an important piece here. So, okay. Well, here's a sixth idea, and that's to seek out professional help. If I'm really struggling with fear and anxiety in COVID or in anything else, one of my best words of advice is not to try to go it alone. It is very likely that your own personal support system is good enough for most kinds of routine fear and concern. Just talking that out with someone, having a conversation, having someone else who sort of talks you off the cliff, as it were, can be very, very powerful. And at the same time, there are folks who that just doesn't get the job done. That doesn't get anywhere close to reducing this. And this fear now has become a debilitating experience in my life. It's keeping me from doing the things I enjoy doing. And I'm, people around me are starting to do that, but I'm saying, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. It may be that most of the population, and that the best evidence we have is that this is a safe level of activity, and I'm still down here because I fear too much, and none of my friends, none of my family can seem to move me off the dime from that particular perspective. That might be an indication that it would be helpful for me to talk to somebody about the fear. If there is a pre-existing history of an anxiety disorder, or even if things tend to make me very frightened on an ongoing basis, and that way predates any COVID experience. This is not new with COVID. COVID has just given me cover for a new reason to be scared of the world around me. That's indication that consultation with a professional would be helpful. And I've listed some of those professionals that might be helpful, and I think we're all in different places as to which ones of these we might choose to reach out to. Certainly, for people who are part of a faith community, it could be helpful to speak to clergy about it. I would probably not spend much time talking to clergy who indicate to you theologically that they believe that fear is simply you're not trusting God, or you're somehow a lack of faith, or whatever the case may be. I probably would not look to that clergy person as a source for how to manage fear if their primary stock in trade is to belittle you or to belittle your faith for thinking that. But that can be a great place to start. It may also be helpful to speak to your personal physician. And none of these, by the way, are perfect, and I'll go back in a minute and explain where I think the deficient, well, I've already talked about clergy. I'll tell you why I think personal physicians are not the best place and not the only place, and wouldn't be the only place I get my resources from. I teach physicians, and I know what we teach. What we teach is that when patients come to see you, you need to send them away with some kind of a plan. And that plan, more frequently than not, includes some kind of pharmaceutical. And while we have great drugs to help manage anxiety disorders, what we know about anxiety disorders is that drugs alone do not manage them effectively. It is sometimes using a pharmaceutical in combination with psychotherapy, preferably cognitive behavioral therapy, to help learn some new coping strategies and to learn some ways to actually deal with fear and to learn some relaxation techniques and some of those kinds of things. That's what we have found to be most efficacious or most effective in taking care of fear and anxiety. It is not to just throw medication at it alone. That is not a good remedy for dealing with anxiety disorders. It works better with depression, but it does not work all that well with anxiety disorders. So that's and honestly, most physicians don't have anything else in their tool belt than that. They might refer to a psychotherapist, but in my experience, the vast majority don't, and therefore there may be very little benefit there, but it may be the only port I have in this storm. A third option is to look to a mental health professional, preferably someone who is licensed and licensed is a foregone conclusion, but also is has some expertise in working with anxiety disorders. If it is a severe anxiety disorder that has a particular trauma at its root, which anxiety disorders often do, we don't. Post-traumatic stress disorder is not exact. We don't classify it as an anxiety disorder anymore. We did for many years. We see it as its own thing now, but that's usually an event-focused anxiety that started because I was in a bad car wreck or I was assaulted or something like that. And what we know is that medication and a number of different treatment modalities like eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, cognitive behavioral therapy that I've already mentioned, can be very beneficial for folks in managing some of that. And then, though I've already spoken about it, don't rule out the possibility for medication. The downside to mental health professionals, of course, is that sometimes we don't get to the root of the problem very quickly, or sometimes not at all. And the reality is that we aren't a panacea either. We certainly, almost certainly don't take the place, for example, of a strong support community around you and people with whom you can talk and share confidentially and some of those kinds of things. But those are some possibilities for reaching out to professionals. What I would be looking for here is, has my anxiety, has the fear that I have become disabling enough that it is preventing me from doing the things that I most enjoy doing? I don't want to be around my children or my grandchildren because in an ongoing basis for months on end, I'm fearful that they will somehow contaminate me, make me sick, and there's a place where I just have to draw a line. I think that's kind of, if I don't want to put words in Barry's mouth, but that's part of what I heard early on, is there comes this point in life when we say, you know what, I'm not going to live forever. I have a colleague who was just telling me today that last year, it would have been my colleague's mother-in-law in another state, I don't think was particularly ill, but there was some conversation in the family about, do we go see grandma during the summer or don't we, and some of those kinds of things. And she was rather insistent that I would rather take my chances to see my grandchildren than I am particularly concerned about staying COVID-free. And if I get COVID, I'll deal with it. That, I think, was kind of how the conversation went. Well, as it turned out, the family did agree to go and visit with her, spent great time. Apparently it was an outstanding visit and that sort of thing. Just a few months later, the grandmother had a fall. That fall sort of became a downward spiral very quickly, and she died during the winter when she had not been ill at all really during the summer. And I think that points up the fact that none of us is promised tomorrow, and we can work really hard to stay safe from COVID and end up dying in a car crash or dying from something else altogether, because remember point 2 back there, that fear reminds me that I'm not in charge. All right, so here's the 7th idea, and that's to embrace a spiritual focus in your life. One of the things that I have discovered in my own life is that as I work on the spiritual me, as I work on the piece of me that is transcendent, that I exercise, as it were, through worship or liturgy or ritual or reading of sacred texts or prayer, or meditation or mindfulness, being with others in my community of faith, whether in person or online or those kinds of things. All of those pieces work together to help me remember what my purpose is, what my calling is, and what's most important in life, the kinds of things that I will value, the kinds of things that I treasure. And I think having a spiritual purpose or a spiritual perspective helps me to stay present in the fact that this disease is not the end of the world. For me, I think it is determining, and everybody has to find this on their own, I believe, or find this for themselves, I guess is the right way to say it. The universal idea that I should lock myself away from the rest of the world is not acceptable to everyone because of their own spiritual perspective. That time with family is more valuable than, for example, physical health or physical safety. And not everyone can determine that, or no one can determine that for you. I think you have to determine that. Now, the wonderful thing about living in families and in relationships is we get to negotiate.